Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Modern Market. This is our daily show from Monday to Friday at 7 a.m. Eastern Time and 11 a.m. GMT at the moment. We do this every single day, Monday to Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Next week, it will be the same too. Daylight savings is not kicking in yet, but we will be back. Don't worry about that. We will get into everything to do with the NFT market, the crypto market, and also just how to make some or a lot of money in this crazy market at the moment. I'm your host, Beechek. I'm joined by my legendary co-hosts, Legendary and Sammy. And just a reminder before we get into the show that nothing that we say here is financial advice. This modern market is exceptionally risky. We do not know anything for sure. So please do proceed with caution and exercise your own judgment. With that out of the way, Legendary, it is Wednesday, the 20th of March. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
GM, doing quite well. Still not worried about the market. And I'm in that happy state. Like I said yesterday, that I basically managed to restructure my portfolio to allocate into things I wanted to allocate in. And now it's weird because I know I have an overview over my funds, over my investments. I know that money is allocated the way I wanted it to be allocated. I'm still playing around with a couple of new things, especially after Brad yesterday mentioned that Pendlify thing, where you can get that 40x multiplier on swell points. So still like playing around with new things, but it's a feeling that I've haven't had in more than a year, where I'm basically content with the state of my portfolio.
What a nice position to be in, especially given the absolute insanity on the timeline, at least from the last few days. I do think that there's a lot of stress out there of like trying to get into particular things, mostly because people are trying to get into particular things and they know that they need to get out of them pretty quickly too. And so that increases like this level of anxiety on the timeline. But I have seen some bigger accounts kind of express a similar position to you, Legendary, which is if you've been buying some of these assets before, then you're pretty much just riding them out now. And yes, you might need to do some restructuring every now and again, but you're already up in a big way. I remember we were talking to you about like when you were buying into Solana earlier, like not super stressed about that anymore, right? Whereas if you're sidelined, that's where you might be a little bit more stressed. So that is interesting to hear. I'm going to pull up actually a tweet from Bread because you mentioned that. I want to share that with the audience because he spoke about it on the show yesterday. It was really helpful. I want to bring that to the audience's attention. While I do that, in the meantime, Sammy, how are you doing? How are you feeling about your position in the market at the moment? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I exited a lot of my meme coin Solana positions, so that was all
Did
kind of
you?
rotated back into various other plays over the weekend. So
Okay.
I think I'm pretty much set. Just let it all slide, just to airdrop farm, do other bits and pieces, but also enable me to free up some time just to actually start digging into what I think the next trend is going to be, and then just kind of allocating my time accordingly. So yeah, feeling good, feeling less stressed.
Interesting. I know you do spend a bit more time than me, for example, trying to catch the next trend, and like you work on sometimes shorter time frames. How was your exit from the meme coin stuff? I know a lot of them have given up a lot of the gains in the last 24 hours or 48 hours. Were you ahead of that? Did you decide to cut your losses, or however much they went down in the last few days, just like, okay, well, I'm still up and go out? Like, what was your positioning there?
Yeah, I mean, I exited. So my biggest position was Bohm, and I exited that probably about 20% off the highs.
Nice.
I think I probably have a little bit left in there, but I'm just going to leave that, forget about it. Similar with a few other coins that have come out, I've just kind of got some positions in there, but just leaving it coming into the elections as well. So I think some of those new coins are going to have the political ones are probably going to have a little bit of a pump. But outside of that, it's very little capital allocated there now. So it's just kind of more looking into what I think from a technical standpoint is going to be interesting. Just so, I mean, that's what vibe I like. I don't really like to try and stress about trying to time the top of a meme coin. It's not really my bag. So
Yeah,
I think I've just rotated that into things that I'm actually genuinely interested in.
sure. Okay. That sounds pretty interesting. I'm sure it's an interesting perspective for people to hear about either way. Before we get into the headlines today, Legendary mentioned this bread thread, which, if you don't know, it's not going to be a main topic for today because we're talking about other things. We're going to get into a discussion on base, since that's been popping up on the timeline today. We're going to compare it with Solana because that seems to be two things that are going against each other at the moment. But just to touch on it, this ETHFi airdrop came in a couple of days ago. It was a $3.5 billion FDV. And Brad wrote this really interesting thread about why Swell, which is a way for you to stake your ETH, could be the next potential play. So this is what Legendary was talking about. I've got it up on the screen for people watching in. I'm just going to share the tweet with the boys in the chat here, and then maybe they can put it in the comments if you are interested in getting exposure to the Ethereum restaking narrative at the same time, which personally, we've been speaking about restaking quite a lot, because on the one hand, you have people saying, what's the point of ETH? It's kind of missing out from all of this crazy activity on Solana. And then Bitcoin's obviously got the ETF stuff, which is causing huge inflows. Like, what's the point of ETH? And to me, it's quite obvious that this restaking thing is the big deal for ETH going on at the moment. But some people don't see it. So those are just my thoughts. Let's get into the daily headlines from the Snapshot, which is, as always, pinned up top. This goes out every single day to give you all the quick hits of news that you need to know from the previous 24 hours. If you do find it brings you some value today, please do give it a like. So let's get into it, starting with the price action. We've got Bitcoin at 63K, just down 1%. ETH at 3.2K, down 1%. Solana down 3% at $172. First headline, Blackrock announces a $100 million tokenized investment fund. We're going to get into those details in just a little bit to find out what that means. Number two, Remelios and Miladies up 30% and 20% to 4.1 ETH and 0.9 ETH respectively. Those are the biggest movers in the NFT market, and they are routinely beating the rest of the NFT market. So want to just have a quick discussion on that too. And finally, runestones on Bitcoin continue to rise to 0.056 BTC floor. That is 3.5K. Remember, there's 100,000 in that collection. Would love to just figure out what precisely is going on there. We've touched on it before. Ordinals, clearly a big deal at the moment, had $7.2 million daily volume on runestones in the last 24 hours. Getting into some notable sales. Floor prices, we've got CryptoPunks at 51 ETH, up a couple of percent. Bored Apes at 13, down 2%. Mutants at 2.3. DGods at 1.4. Captains at 3.9. Azuki's at 3.8, down 1%. Penguins recovering a little bit, trying to touch 11 ETH at 10.9. Mad Lads finally crumbling a little bit under the pressure of aggressively rising Sol price, down to 155 Sol, which is down 8%. Still relatively strong compared to all the other NFTs. Mad Lads were just rock solid at 190 for a long time. And then the Nouns winning bid was at 5.7 ETH. We had a Node Monk hoodie sale for almost 2 Bitcoin, a Node Monk gold sale for 2.1 Bitcoin, and a CryptoPunk selling for 52 ETH. Legendary, that is the price action. Those are the headlines. Before we get into a bigger discussion on Sol versus base, and then all of those headline pieces of news, is there any numbers catching your attention?
Definitely the Node Monkeys, more so because we had 2 more golden ones selling yesterday. We now have the golden one plus the hoodie one also selling at a very, very similar price point. So at least it seems to me that the frequency of the more rare sales on the Node Monkeys is increasing, which I personally quite like to see.
Yeah. I do think the rarity is being appreciated to some extent, and they're certainly quite routine buys at a higher than floor price. Oxy, want to throw to you here just before we get into the major stuff. Is there anything catching your attention in terms of the price action or any of the numbers we've mentioned so far? Welcome to the stage, my friend.
Thank you. Good morning, guys. So just looking at this BlackRock tokenized fund of 100 million USDC, it sounds like. First off, I think it's hilarious that BlackRock's kind of doing this to the SEC. First off, they're like, oh, you don't like, I guess, cryptocurrency in general. Here's a Bitcoin ETF, and then on top of it, Ethereum ETF, and then $100 million Ethereum fund. Oh, you know what? We're going to add staking to that, which you also hate. So it's kind of like I don't know. Sounds like they're kind of slapping them in the face. But I guess my kind of tinfoil hat or like super speculative thoughts on the $100 million USDC fund. I'm curious, does this have any RWA indications to it? Like, I know a lot of the RWA like protocols like Parcel usually denominate in USDC or like stables. Like, on top of the staking aspect that they're including in this ETF or this fund, does RWA come into play here at all, do you think?
I would say I just don't know. I don't know if there's enough details that have been shared at this point on the details, but we are going to dive into it in just a little bit. So to the extent that we have details on this fund, we have an article to go through in just like in a few minutes when we dive into it into more detail. So we'll see what comes up there. I don't know the extent to which there's RWA consequences though, but interesting question. We'll dive into it in one sec. Before we get into that, the key discussion points for today, as always, before we get into the headlines, I try to pick up some key discussion points from the timeline from the previous 24 hours. Is this emerging battle between Solana and Base? I don't know if this is like a real battle. I don't know if this is a figment of people's imagination or whether it's a figment of my imagination, but there's definitely in the last 24 hours, somehow people are pivoting to Base. People want to talk about Base. Maybe it's to do with X copies mint, which happened on Base. He released a very cheap like open edition, which is still live for minting. But also there's just all kinds of momentum about Base. Coinbase has got all these users. Base is like a home run waiting to happen. And then kind of comparing it with Solana. So here's the first take. And again, I'm going to share this for the people watching in on YouTube and on X, but also I'll read it out for the people who are just listening in on the space. This was the first kind of tweet that set me off to note that this was a conversation happening, but we had multiple from prominent accounts as well. Ansem started with Coinbase has 100 million registered users. They're building a native smart wallet that allows normies to trade on-chain seamlessly without storing any seed phrase or any of that. They have their own L2. What about this trade setup is hard to understand? So clearly the position here is like, look, they've just got all these people. They're going to onboard all of these people direct into their L2. What's the question? There's really no question here. It should be an obvious trade. However, Moon Overlord replied in the comments, and we'll go to some of his more comments. There's nothing to buy, and it's a forced narrative by people who've missed Sol. Can they get some adoption in the future? Sure, I don't know. I'm happy to buy something if it starts doing well. And I think that's always been the criticism of L2s, right? It's always been the criticism of L2s that yes, it's a cool concept. Yes, maybe even if your marketing is good, it's the same criticism of Blast in some way. It's like, yeah, you've attracted some TVL, you've attracted some attention, but what is there to do? What is there to participate in on your chain? I think the next thought I wanted to go to was Moon's again, where he said there's more tweets about base season than coins on the chain. It kind of feels like all the people who miss Solana are trying to spin up a new narrative, to be honest. There's 4 different dexes doing multiples of volume than the entire base chain is doing just on Solana. So Solana has 4 different dexes doing more than the entire chain on base. Base is barely in the top 10 for chain volume. Is this base season in the room with us right now? I guess suggesting that this is a figment of our own imagination or a narrative being concocted by, and then this is the final take, which I liked and would love to hear your thoughts on this, guys, in a second now. Ceteris, who quote tweeted that tweet and said, the reason why so many people are trying to make base season happen is twofold. Number one, the realization that you need to pick an EVM L2 to congregate activity around. Maybe people are getting sick of there being so many different L2s and like, look, we need to pick one. Shall we pick base? And the second one, and this one I hadn't thought of, but it probably makes sense to me. Many influencers have large friend tech point allocations, and thus driving more activity to base is positive EV over others. And that is in addition to the obvious ones, which is base has the Coinbase flow onboarding, good support from Coinbase, etc., etc. Legendary. A lot to take in there, but in general, I think you kind of got the trajectory. People start pushing, have started to push base. But however, it doesn't have much actual traction. Is it related to this kind of influencer move related to friend tech? Is it related to the fact that there's too many L2s. What are your thoughts?
Let me add one more take to that
Yes.
assortment of takes by Beanie, saying Chinese gamblers are all moving to base, new micro meta forming, phantom to MetaMask migration underway. Finally bullish for ETH? Question mark. Absolutely love that as well. On a more serious note, I do think there's quite a lot going on in the background. If you've watched some of the partnership announcements when it comes to Base, for example, Avagotchi has announced that their settlement layer is now going to be on Base. So they're exploring on the gaming side of things. There's apparently more gaming partnerships happening.
Okay.
We had Gangsters Arena recently launch on Base as well. So there's definitely incentivizing happening from Base as a chain for people to move over there or to explore at least parts, like in Avagotchi's case with the settlement layer on that chain on the one hand. On the other hand, or I did not on the other hand, additionally, I also think if you randomly out of nowhere almost have an artist as big as Xcopy doing an open edition that gets a lot of traction exactly in the moment when the chatter around Base is increasing is not a coincidence. I do think that there's like some incentives going on around that as well. Then you also had prominent people like DC Investor saying, I just recently did withdraw, I don't know how many ETH from Coinbase and was lending on Aave against that.
Yeah,
and all it did cost me was 1 or 2 cents in transaction fees. And I mean, honestly, you can do that with all other layer 2 solutions right now as well, especially after the ETH upgrade where costs on L2 have decreased. And then you have that base amount, no pun intended, of like attention that the chain is getting, and other influencers and people are jumping on that bandwagon because they want to be ahead of the trend, etc. I do think that a like quote unquote mini base season has been going on for a while. If you watch people like Min and others who have been trading meme coins on Base quite successfully, but it was not as prominently on the timeline because Solana was taking all of the attention. It seems like that with the market correction, that meme coin season is not fading out. That's not the right term, but it's getting less attention on the timeline. So obviously, if you do want to repeat the same pattern, you can always do it on another chain because we do like to move in cycles and just repeat similar things on different chains and call them completely different. So I think it's a mix of all those things. But I do think that there is a larger marketing campaign happening from Coinbase's side to concentrate and drive more attention to the L2 for sure.
Okay. Very interesting perspectives there. I think all of those thoughts are valid. Definitely want to go to Phunky and K Sensei, who have their hand raised in just a second as well. Sammy, I want to touch in with you as well. You were sharing some maybe gaming perspectives beforehand. I don't know if you want to share those or just your general thoughts on the Base movement as well. And I have a follow-up question about Coinbase too.
Yeah, I think so. I think Legendary mentioned about Beanie and that is it the Chinese influence coming over? I think that's been there on Base through Cambria, which was a RuneScape style PvP game that's now on Blast. And in the Telegram dueling chats, I think that kind of is, there's a bit of a PvP sort of East versus West going on there as well. So it's just interesting to see that dynamic accumulating all these party hats. So I think there's definitely that element coming through. But yeah, I don't know. I think like Coinbase has always been very smart about bringing in those partnerships. They had Coca-Cola when it first launched. They had all these other artists that created all these NFTs that you could mint. They had Parallel, which is doing pretty well. Yeah, I think they're in a very unique position where they have a user base, they have distribution. So the 100 million, I didn't yet, 100 million users on their main centralized exchange. And I've just shared a video in there about how seamless it is for them to then transfer through to that wallet and then start interacting on the Base chain. And I think that's going to become, well, the UX for that is going to become 10 times easier over the next 6 to 12 months. So they're in a very strong position because they have a product and they have distribution. And if you nail both of those, then you've got product market fit. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 6 months.
Yeah, look, I mean, I definitely take that point, right? I take the point that they're in a very, very unique position in order to divert people to Base. I take that point. One follow-up question I was thinking first before we go to Phunky and K Sensei that I wanted to just check in with Legendary is kind of related to what Runelord in the YouTube comments has just suggested. I'm going to share two tickers here because it's two he's mentioned. I don't think they're particularly difficult to find when you're thinking of coins on Base, but it's not an endorsement, of course. Runelord said, I have a small position on Mochi and Toshi, which are two meme coins on Base. And he also said, would love to know what other tokens I need to add on that chain. And this is the thing that I have noticed other people expressing the opinion, which is people like there's an appetite to want to do something there, but people are just like, well, what shall I do? Because there isn't, like, for whatever reason, people are not convinced by what already exists. It's like, yeah, okay, we're going to try to get some exposure. Maybe we'll buy some of this one or that one, but they're not convinced. They're like, I would love to know what else I can do. And follow-up question, Legendary, or the main question here is, if in doubt, should you just be buying Coinbase stock? Like, is there any point speculating on all this stuff? If you're so bullish on Coinbase and so bullish on Base, is the ticket to buy coin? What are your thoughts?
Depends. Answering your second question first, really depends on what what you want to do with your investment horizon and with your expectations towards returns. If you're more interested to be early, I mean, early in Base is a bit of a stupid statement to make because the chain has been around for quite a while, but people are making it up, posting things like, oh, I'm now diving into Base. It's so interesting. So it feels early from the attention that it seems to be getting.
Yeah.
And if you want to be like part of some early meme coin plays because you want to, catch a 100x or 1000x, then definitely that would rather be the strategy. If you're like, okay, I just want to have exposure to Base via the coin stock, then the question is, why not then just buy ETH and hold ETH? Because if that is a successful L2 and onboards a shit ton of people, which would be the hypothesis there, then the underlying asset will also profit from that. If you have a stock portfolio and want to rotate that more towards crypto, then yeah, sure, you could do coin. All of that obviously not being financial advice. Sure. But it really depends on investment horizon and the target that you set for profits and what you want to do on that chain.
Yeah, look, I think that's fair. It's fair perspective. I want to compare this a little bit to Solana actually in just a little bit. But before we do that, I want to throw to our renowned guests and speakers. Phunky, I think your hand was raised first. Let's go to you first, my friend. What are your thoughts on this kind of narrative of Base? It's kind of existed for a little bit. People want to believe in Base, but it's definitely intensified over the last 24 hours. What are you thinking about Base?
GM Modern Market Fam. Yeah, I just wanted to offer sort of an aside comment because ETH Denver Base had the biggest probably section out of any of the chains there.
Interesting.
They had a massive sprawling thing almost in the center of the main event. And they were even doing sort of like a Pokemon Go, the thing where you would walk around and do, try and find stuff. They had something very similar where it had, I think, like 30 steps, and it was riddles, and people were going around and trying to find things to get certain merch. People were minting sort of Polaroid pictures on chain right then and there. They were going all out in terms of just like a true blitz, trying to get people's attention at ETH Denver. So Base, I think, is here to stay. To your point that you guys brought up in terms of how many other L2s it's going to compete against, that's going to be stiff. But at the end of the day, this is still sort of a project that is owned by Coinbase. You guys know how bullish I am on Coinbase in general, just in terms of the thesis I've shared in the Modern Market Discord. I really wouldn't bet against Base at the end of the day. And I hold Toshi as well because my wife wanted some. Not financial advice, of course.
Well, not financial advice from you, but your wife seems to be performing quite well in her portfolio. So we do accept financial advice from your wife. Shout out to Phunky's wife. Shout out to P. Dito in the comments as well. It's funny how much of an influence IRL events like take a hold of people's attention. Like you just mentioned ETH Denver. P. Dito mentioned the Base team were also at ETH Global. And I have noticed as well that at these particular events, that not only are they held in very high regard, but they're just doing more stuff than other people. Like, when was the last time I've been to these things and Arbitrum have been front and center? Or when has it been Optimism front and center? I know all those people do really good things separate to IRL stuff, and maybe they're even doing great IRL stuff too. I don't know 100%. But my point is, it feels like Base is doing maybe a better job of that IRL component, because I noticed them. Where was the last place I was internationally? In Miami, for example. At the Miami event, they had a really cool setup. They'd had like some base house, which I visited, and it was pretty cool. So they're doing it routinely and very consistently, which is interesting to observe. K-Sensei, would love to hear your thoughts on this. Welcome to the stage, my friend. What are you thinking about base?
Yo, GM. I'm someone who like really buys into the whole roll-up centric narrative, so
Okay.
I've been spending a lot of time on L2s. That said, I think the sudden passion everyone has for base is kind of pushed financially, probably.
Okay.
I don't think it's just a naturally shifting narrative. And I honestly don't know if it plays like in base's favor that it's like labeled the Fed chain. You know, someone I guess like likes that because Coinbase will forever push it. Someone is like wary. And I just want to say it has kind of an ecosystem, you know, all the SocialFi stuff happens there, like Farcaster with its own meme coins.
True.
And there's like Zora uses, you know, base ETH too.
Okay.
So there's like this little ecosystem that exists. And I think what's happening now is kind of like on-chain summer too, if anyone remembers that. There was like a mania of shitcoins with like Bald, and then there suddenly were all these artists with NFTs, and then it kind of died down. So maybe this is the second attempt. And one more thing I want to highlight is, you know, like most L2s, it's moving towards decentralization, but unlike other ones, it doesn't have a token yet. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect one, even though it's like under the aegis of Coinbase. You know, tokens are the way to align incentives on these chains. So I think that's definitely to its advantage. And maybe it's not misplaced hopes.
Yeah, I like that take for two reasons. One, we've been covering the coverage of the potential base token quite a lot. I remember months ago we said there was a lawyer who kind of was talking about how they're moving towards decentralization and how I think they might have even specifically mentioned the token, although don't quote me on that directly. Then they actually came out and flat out denied it. So there has been like a flat out denial. Want to be very clear on that. However, we obviously know in this space, sometimes you're allowed to flat out deny something and then just do it anyway a bunch of time later. So I'm actually leaning towards that camp. That's just my opinion. It's not something guaranteed in any single way, but that's just my current opinion. So I'm kind of leaning in that direction as well to K-Sensei. The final thing I wanted to touch on this, Jack, I see with your hand raised, maybe you'll be able to answer this question if it's directly to do with this, because I want to take it in this direction, is like the comparison with Solana specifically. We've spoken about how base has got its own merits, got its own drawbacks, got its own potential, but it seems to be getting pitted against Solana to some extent. And just one of the things I've noticed in the last few days, and the Solana maxis can metaphorically shoot me if they want to, is that Solana is not working. Like I had to unwind a couple of positions, and I would say 50% of the time it was working. So 1 out of 2 transactions would just not go through. And that's frustrating and that's annoying. And obviously it's got a lot of activity on it now. It's got a lot of attention, which is great and very bullish Solana for those reasons. But it wasn't working half the time. So Jack, maybe you can take this first and then want to hear Legendary put a conclusion on this. What are your thoughts on Solana versus base and the fact that it's just basically not working from what I can tell on certain occasions at the moment?
Yeah, I think one thing to note is that there is an update coming that addresses some of this. I forget the name of the update, but and that has been sort of noted and addressed, and it isn't a narrative that we haven't seen before on Sol. One thing that is very, very clear with Sol since SBF and the massive tanking is its resilience. I can't say the same for Coinbase. It's my biggest concern about base is that it requires, and we've seen this with Blair as well, with Blast, it requires down periods in terms of attention. And it requires the fact that there may be slow periods. And that's something I haven't seen from Coinbase in the same way that I've seen from Sol. Like for a specific example, I think it was just mentioned, but their NFT ecosystem, where literally in the last bull run, if an NFT project was announced to be partnering with Coinbase's NFT platform, it ripped to high heaven, and then no one used it, and then they basically just ran this down. I do wonder what happens with this huge corporation if it doesn't see immediate upside, and that there is a downtime or, you know, a new bear market. Like, how does that impact long term on Base, especially when you see NFTs and things that, you know, require longevity and perseverance, when they don't have, you know, this huge board to sort of placate to, and to always have to be number one. And if they're not number one, do they can maintain that attention? So yeah, I'm more of a Sol Maxi on this point, but I do think Sol has some major concerns to address. And if this update that they do have coming up doesn't address those concerns, then, you know, we will see some shaky times over there as well.
Look, I think that's actually a very reasonable perspective, because my instinctive reaction was to say, well, okay, like, I think this L2 is way too important for the future of the kind of Base ecosystem, Coinbase, and extending out into being more integrated into the broader crypto ecosystem. But then at the same time, like, I would have thought that about NFTs too. Like, I think NFTs are super important, and they completely fumbled that. So I think that's actually a fair criticism, which people who are newer to the space might not know, that Coinbase did try to enter the NFT market back in either 2021 or early 2022 and completely fumbled it. It was an atrocious attempt, if we're being completely honest. And then they just abandoned it. So I still think that this is different, because it's far more important from an infrastructure perspective, but I think it's a fair criticism to bring up. So thanks for that, Jack. One quick shout out to the Mike Elf, and I think this is fair again. You said you have to mention Degen when talking about Base, which is a token. It's at an all-time high. It was free distribution, and this was to do with Warpcast. So the stuff going on with Farcaster, which K-Sensei mentioned as well. Very, very interesting stuff. So there are some clearly consumer use cases for Base, which are playing out as we speak. Legendary, a final take from you on like the Solana comparison and the fact that my experience recently has been quite difficult with it. Have you experienced the same thing? Any final point?
Yeah, absolutely. Have experienced the same thing as you on Solana. I think one thing that really helps with that is just to increase your priority fee, because fees are so cheap either way, and then you have a better chance to get your stuff through. But of course, there is the difference between how fast and cheap Solana is as a chain, and not the most live or not the most resilient ones compared to others, which definitely also makes a difference in the user base. But to me, culturally speaking, the most significant difference would be you have people who have, you know, survived the trauma around Solana crash that was more tremendous than in every other asset in the bear market, and who, you know, held their bags, bought more Sol, are up 10x, are up 20x on that, and now are like very, very fond of themselves and very happy to share that narrative that Solana is the ETH killer and ETH is gonna die either way, and nobody cares about TVL or dev hours being put in. So you have a bit of a like ETH versus Solana mentality that is maybe more directed at mainnet or at the whole ecosystem, including all L2s, but you have that strong foundation from the people who basically quote unquote survived FTX. Whereas I would say that with not only Base, but many of the other L2s, you don't really have like a specific core community yet that is like united in passion by an event like Solana and FTX. It's just people exploring an L2. And yes, Warpcast, Farcast are amazing tools, and there's definitely a community there, and they like exploring Base more and more. And as you said, the play with Degen or the Degen airdrop is a quite significant one. But I don't think that it's culturally as strong as the Solana community at this point in time.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. Very interesting perspectives. I'm very glad we brought that conversation out there today, and that we spent a reasonable amount of time discussing it, because I think this Base narrative definitely has got hyper pushed the past 24 hours, and it's something that could be related also to these financial incentives tied to various people who are going to receive either airdrops on Base and anything of that nature too. So interesting to have that conversation out loud. Hope you enjoyed. Let's get into the headlines now, though. We want to get straight into the BlackRock headline, which was in the snapshot, which is pinned up top as always. And this is the headline which shared that BlackRock and Securitize have launched the BlackRock USD Institutional Digital Liquidity Fund. So this is another great milestone for the tokenization of assets. Robert Leshner tweeted that. DC investors' take on that is this. He says, Larry Fink talks nonstop about tokenization, relentlessly pushing for an ETH ETF. And now BlackRock is building on Ethereum, the only smart contract chain suitable for high value institutional use. Just for a bit more context and background for the people who don't know, we've got this article here from The Block, which we'll just hit some headlines from. BlackRock to launch tokenized investment fund with Securitize. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, has notified regulators that it will offer a tokenized pooled investment fund. According to the filing, the pooled investment fund will require outside investors to put down a minimum of $100,000. The notice shows the fund's estimated sales commissions are set at $525K. I don't know if that's necessarily important. A token called BlackRock USD Institutional Digital Liquidity Fund, with the ticker being BIDL, was created on March the 5th on the Ethereum blockchain. According to Etherscan, it has a maximum quantity of 100 tokens, but so far only one holder. That's an interesting little detail which I haven't seen reported. And then a bit of further context. Obviously, since regulators gave it the green light in January, BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF has accumulated 15.5 billion in assets under management, making it the second largest spot Bitcoin ETF. According to data compiled, the firm has over $9 trillion in assets under management. Legendary, you first here. What are your reflections on this BlackRock news? Do you consider it very significant? And the specific choice of doing this on Ethereum, then would love to hear your thoughts, Sammy.
I consider it as super significant news in basically the light of BlackRock's broadest strategy on blockchain cryptocurrencies. The last thing we reported apart, obviously, from the ETF approval is that they now included their own Bitcoin ETFs in some of the products that they are offering, as a way to obviously have a bit more exposure to crypto, but to also like being able to outperform the stock market. Now you have this very active thing coming into Ethereum mainnet to probably experiment around with DeFi, to invest into various vehicles, etc., which serves multiple purposes. It takes it one step further than just having BTC exposure in some of the products that they're financial products that they're offering. B, it is, if they're doing well on that, it is an insanely effective advertisement for a potential Ethereum ETF, because if you basically can show, hey, ETH is a productive asset, this is what we've been doing with our own 100 mil, this is the profits that we made on that, this is the applications that we were being able to use, whether it's DeFi, RWAs, whatever they might be interested in, it's a very, very good advertisement for an ETH ETF. And C, it also goes so many steps further than just being, someone passively investing into an ETF, into BTC or into ETH, and really trying to actively participate, which kind of indicates that they're taking this very, very seriously, and they have a very high interest to make that ETH ETF a reality. And last point on that, to me, it's pretty obvious that this is happening on ETH and not on Solana and not anywhere else, which is not me dunking on Solana. But again, if you come in as an institution, you need to be on the most resilient chain that always works, that has the biggest and broadest ecosystem. And obviously, that only other chain right now that is realistically able to have an ETF in the very soon future.
Interesting. I love that perspective. All kinds of really interesting points made there. Sammy, what's your take on BlackRock's move here onto Ethereum?
I'd agree with Legendary. I think it is very much an experiment. If you look at the amount compared to their total assets under management, it's like 0.001%. So it's small, but in the grand scheme of things, in that notional amount is quite sizable. But I do think that it makes sense that the biggest asset manager goes on ETH to experiment. You've got like JP Morgan uses Onyx, which is like their own permission blockchain. I think it is EVM. I don't know if it's settled on ETH, but they've done some various products on there and trialed it out, and that was successful. You've got Citibank tokenizing assets on Avalanche. I know ANZ have been doing work with Chainlink to have off-chain securities and stuff like that. So yeah, I can see all these banks. They're choosing their horse. They don't know which one they're going to go for, but it makes sense that Blackrock trials ETH because it has been around for since 2015, so 9 years now. So it has that historical provenance. It's got a lot of L2, it's got a lot of activity, the most TVL. So yeah, it makes sense to me.
Interesting. You did mention some big banks there, Citibank, for example, who've gone in the direction of Avalanche. Do you see that something that people will like row back from in time? Do you think it's like, as you say, because there's relatively small amounts, it's just an experiment for these institutions at this point? How do you see that playing out? I
don't think it's going to be one chain. I think there will be a lot of these omni-chain solutions that enable people to bridge between chains seamlessly eventually. I think that you're going to have these lending solutions where you deposit collateral on one, but then you take out a loan on a separate chain. So I was playing around with Pike Finance the other day, and that's based on Sol, but I was taking out loans on Arbitrum. So just looking at that and seeing that come through, it's like, well, actually, we're talking about these single chains as if they're in like on their own, but actually, I think the tech that's coming through now is enabling them to transition between and unlock that fragmented liquidity. So I think it's all an experiment for them at the moment. They're seeing what's going on. I think was it Franklin Templeton? They've recently launched a Web3 venture or like a Twitter thing. So it's just interesting to see what they come up with. But they've been playing around with ETH for a long time. They run their own nodes. I think even back in like 2018, 2017, they had that spun up. So I think they've been around for a while. It's just that they're now making a public statement that they're experimenting. So yeah, I think it will lead into probably strengthening the ETH ETF as well.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. You mentioned this kind of cross-chain solutions. One of the protocols which won the Jupiter launchpad, Jupiter, obviously the biggest DEX on Solana, was running a competition to figure out what are the first 2 coins that were going to launch on its launchpad. One of them is Sharkify, which is the main NFT lending protocol on Solana. The second one is Zeus Network, and it won by a complete landslide. It was a huge majority. And it was all to do with bringing, I'm just looking at their profile here, it's about bringing Bitcoin to Solana permissionlessly without censorship, and more importantly, distributing wrapping / performances back to the Zeus node. So I think it's to do with like wrapping your Bitcoin, or like Bitcoin native staking will be possible through the Zeus network layer, allowing it to begin earning yield, which brings more liquidity into Solana. So it's like, I think that's kind of what you mean, right? It's like, yes, you've got some Bitcoin, yes, you've got some ETH, yes, you've got some Solana, but how do you access that on other places? And I think that's maybe what protocols are trying to build out as we move forward. Legendary, any final reflections on that before we maybe hit the NFT market a little bit more generally?
One final reflection would also be that by just being comfortable to deploy 100 mil, even if it's a very, very negligible amount for the total TVL that's locked up via BlackRock, it is still like a sign of confidence that they're happy to do that, and just another like positive signal for that you can trust that chain, you can trust that ecosystem, and it's an ETF worthy thing.
Yeah, I agree. I'm personally very astounded by how everyone thinks so strongly that ETH is like lost when Solana's got all this degen activity, Bitcoin's got digital gold and ETFs. Like, I don't believe ETH is lost in this bigger story. Phunky, just wanted to give you a quick opportunity to come in with a final take on this. Then we're going to hit the Web3 roundup and get into the NFT market more generally.
Great points all around from both Sammy and Legendary, and I just wanted to kind of comment very quickly. This is more than experimentation. I believe JP Morgan is using the Onyx thing as an AVAX subnet, and AVAX is somewhat EVM compatible, although it has like this multiple snow consensus thing. But more importantly, one of the conversations that we've had as infrastructure providers is with Canton Network. And I'm not going to tell you who they're connecting, but this is a highly centralized network that is almost using ZK type technology to move big money around. And there are massive players that I've seen on their sheet for who's getting connected. And I really can't divulge much, but I'll drop a link below about Canton Network so you guys can look into that too.
Yeah, please do. I just heard you say big players and I'm like, okay, I want to know more. I will want to know more on that. Thanks for sharing, Phunky, as always. Let's get into the Web3 Roundup to get you up to speed with everything else that's been happening in the market over the past 24 hours. As always, this comes from the Snapshot, which is pinned up top. And then we'll get into our final discussion to bring the show to a close. So we have the Web3 Roundup. Number one, NFT lending protocol, NFTFi, announces NFTFi Foundation to lead the protocol to decentralization. Shout out to NFTFi, they're in the audience with us today. Number two, Chimpers announces partnership with Nifty Island for 2 games. Nifty Island crushing it across the board, really uniting a bunch of NFT projects all under one banner. Number three, BlackRock wallet. On a more comical note, the BlackRock wallet has sent thousands of dollars of MOG. I wonder what other tokens or how much interest it has yielded by simply depositing, and how they can explain to their investors how much up they are from the various shitcoins that have been sent to it. Number four, Grayscale update their ETH ETF application to include staking. That was the second ETH ETF application that's been updated to include staking in the last couple of days. Next, Mike 3 submits poorly drawn OPEPN as the next set for Jack Butcher's OPEPN. There's a little image there as well of that preview on the Snapshot pinned up top. Xcopy mints open edition on base for $4.95 and earns more than $500,000 in primary sales when last counted. And finally, Rug Radio announces Content Plus, a reward system for consumers of content. Always interested what the other big media players are up to, trying to incentivize engagement. Legendary, that is the Web3 Roundup from around the rest of the space. Getting into the final headlines, we've seen Miladies and Remelios just absolutely ripping in the last 24 hours. I'm going to bring up the NFT heat chart from Mintify so we can get a sense of what's up and what's down. This is for people watching in, but I'll read it out for people who are listening in too. Milady's up 21%. Remilio is up 30%. Doodle's up 10% as well. Lil Pudgy's up 10%. Pixelmon up 10%. Mockaverse up 4%. Moonbird's down 5%, Bored Apes down, Mutant Apes down in general. But Legendary, maybe Remilio's, Milady's first. What are your thoughts there? And then maybe a bit of a broader discussion on what's going on in the NFT market at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when Milady's and Remilio's are going up, it's a pretty good sign to kind of read what sentiment the market has. And if we're like in a bit of a degen / meme coin-esque season, that's always a stage of the market where those two collections are profiting and are going up quite a lot. Another thing, since we're touching on the NFT market, that I noticed that went up quite a lot is the Velocity Series pass by Red Bull. That is up 50% on the day, from 0.3-ish to a 0.52 floor. Okay. I think that they might have announced another artist for the season 2, but I haven't found that yet.
I definitely saw the first announcement, which was K Gollid. I don't know if there's the second announcement yet, so we'll have to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take a second and try to find it in the background.
Awesome. Sammy, what are your thoughts on the NFT market at the moment? My main reflection as someone who's reporting on this every single day is that it's just very erratic, like very, very erratic at the moment. Yes, mostly the main collections have been trending down. That's probably the main directional trend, but really erratic in general, like +3 to 5 to even up to 10% moves on a day quite routinely. What are your reflections at the moment for the NFT market?
Yeah, I think liquidity is an issue regardless, whether it's hypersensitive to announcements, to sentiment. I mean, Pudgies were over 20 ETH not long ago, and they're now back down. So it's like, so to me, I mean, I made a post recently about the direction I think that the market's going in terms of what the next NFT super cycle is going to be. And I think it's going to be a combination of, well, the integration of this DN404, so Saigar et al.'s contract that effectively looks to solve that liquidity problem. So I think we're going to see this up and down with all these projects as announcements come through, but I don't think it's just a band-aid. I don't think there's going to be much outside of that can really fix it until that kind of comes through. And I think that we've seen the Solana meme coin super cycle that you have. It's kind of like a tokenized culture or community that people get behind it, and it's like a speed run to $1 billion market cap. So why can't we see that with NFTs? And I think if you look at the fungibility, if you convert NFTs into a fungible token so that people can get into it at a lower entry, then ultimately you're going to have a lot more people pushing that narrative for that particular project. Now that's how I see the next super cycle taking off. And there's already projects that are building that. I think Asterix dropped recently, June 404 has made an announcement. There's one, I think Underworld is working with Flooring Protocol. So yeah, that's what I've got my eyes on. I think that could become something that hits the market pretty soon.
Okay. That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't really thought about it from that lens. The way I want to take the final 5 minutes is just to bring Ordinals up again. Obviously, the final headline of the snapshot, which is pinned up top, is the runestones, which are up aggressively in the past 24 hours, up to a 0.057 Bitcoin floor, which is 3.6K. I believe there's more than 100,000 supply here. So a pretty huge collection, market cap really very much exploding. I want to put a position forward, or like my idea for Ordinals at the moment. And then I want Jack to argue with me because I think we view it slightly differently. I think Ordinals have the benefit of being shiny and new. And I think the rest of the ETH market has all this kind of baggage. It's got all kinds of baggage from previous cycles, like performance and this and that. And I think a lot of the problems that ETH projects have will transfer to many of these Ordinals projects. Like, it's just a matter of time. I think there's a honeymoon period for Ordinals. That does not mean that I don't think that some of these go insane, because I do think that some of them will. And I think, or it appears that this is what the market is favoring now, whether I think it or not. Clearly, Ordinals are doing better than other things at the moment because they're newer. The price seems to be going up, which seems to make people happy. So I think those two things can be true at the same time. I think it's a bullish scenario for Ordinals, and yet I think it's a honeymoon period which people need to be cautious of. Jack, would love to hear your thoughts, and then Legendary, want a conclusion for you. I know you started playing around a little bit more in Ordinals. Jack, would love to hear your thoughts on like that take, which is kind of, presenting two sides of the argument, but also coming down with a bit of a strong take. And I also want to know why runestones would not be overvalued at this point in time.
Look, I think I'm not arguing with the honeymoon period, but I think if you compare it to the honeymoon period over on ETH, we're just not there yet. Like this is not really the honeymoon period. I think this is the dating period where you're like, oh, okay,
so we're not married yet.
We're not married yet. We haven't hit like peak like euphoria in that sense. For people who weren't there for ETH, it was literally like 3 tiers down on derivatives. If you had allow list, would make you a 10x. That is peak euphoria. Maybe derivatives is a strong word, but like narrative-based derivatives. So think of like Cool Cats being like an art project. You used to have tiers. You used to have Cool Man's Universe being at 2 ETH when Cool Cats was at like 15. And then you used to have like a pop art cat at 0.2 ETH, still making people tons of money from mint. Invisible Friends, all these things, we definitely are not there in the Ordinals perspective yet. That's what I would say. However, I do believe there are two camps that are forming. There are these projects that are coming out right now who are there to take advantage of a narrative, take advantage of this upcycle, and they will hurt people long term. And then there are projects who, I think the best way to define it would just be they have legitimacy in what they are doing. And that's why we're seeing such a strong narrative for projects that have been around during the bear market and have been either cultivating innovation or cultivating a community and been very active in that part. And that's why you're still seeing early inscriptions not taking the zeitgeist as much as other narratives, because essentially it's a bit like the cats. It's the moon cats I'm talking about now, not necessarily cool cats, but it's essentially like these two plays of, yes, okay, they were there early, but then they just gave up the ghost when the bear market really hit and everyone was saying ordinals were dead. And then you have these projects that were there early and just completely fell in love with the tech, fell in love with Bitcoin and what it is doing with ordinals, and they've been there the whole time. In terms of runestones, I think the thing with runestones is, yes, there are over 100k of them, but they aren't all equal. So sort of the narrative that we're already seeing is that the runestones that haven't been traded actively are getting more rewards. There's more projects looking to reward those people than there are generally. So there's already a split there. Also, it seems very clear that because of how runestones was set up, it was basically as solid as an equal opportunity distribution system that you could have got. It was very much just based on people who held free ordinals in their wallets.
This is where people start to lose me, as if it's like some revolutionary way of rewarding people. Like airdrops often go to people who hold assets. That doesn't necessarily mean the contents of the airdrops are going to be like wildly valuable, right?
Yeah, definitely. But the difference is all of them went very, very, like the distribution was literally just like if you'd held stuff through the bear market, you got one of these things. It was one pair wallet. There's huge distribution. And my point is that although you're right, that may be a narrative, also the technical, like the actual way to execute this was wildly complicated. The way that they found those wallets, the way that they airdropped as opposed to, had a mint mechanic go off, all of these things basically now mean that people who do like that narrative on ordinals, and it is a strong one right now, look at the allow list meta, look at the runes meta more generally, it's going to OG collections and OG holders, then now you have this runes project where rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, you can just drop to those same people who've never listed. So I think that is now a new narrative where it's like new runes projects are coming in, and rather than trying to figure out all these wallets, they just go, does it hold a rune? Yes or no, a rune stone. Okay, I'm going to drop to those guys. Has it ever been listed before if they want to go for a next tier? And that, I think, is what we're seeing now in terms of additional momentum.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting stuff. We don't have time to do a further debate on it, but it will definitely be something we cover and continuously cover, because I do think it's super interesting. Just a quick point on it from my perspective before we close out is that I can't see the viability of other people dropping to 100,000 people all the time. Like, I think that's one of the questions I would have with that kind of strand of thinking. But it's definitely something we want to keep talking about, keep monitoring, as long as it's ripping the way it does and is commanding such a high market price and attention. Then yes, we will continue to cover it and dive deeper to figure out why it's doing so well. So thanks so much for that perspective, Jack. Very, very interesting to have the discussion. Legendary, a final reflection before we close out?
I'm happy with my runestone holdings, and probably going to mention my favorite lending protocol again, Liquidium. Also, runestones are available there to borrow, lend against. I know that I sound like I'm being sponsored by Liquidium. I'm not. I wish I were.
Yeah, we should be.
We should be sponsored. We should be sponsored by them. I definitely agree. That's my final thought for the day.
Okay. Good thought. Good final thought. Guys, that is the end of our show. We're so grateful for you joining us. Just a reminder, if you don't know already, we do this every single day live at 7 a.m. Eastern time. We do everything to do with the NFT market, crypto market, and other general ways to try to make some or a lot of money on the internet. We're live on X, we're live on YouTube, but we also publish now directly to Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you find that more convenient. And there'll be more things that we're building out soon as part of the media distribution, and you'll just have to hang around to see what those are. Thank you so much to my co-hosts, Legendary and Sammy. Thank you so much to our contributors, Jack, K-Sensei, and Phunky. And thank you to everyone else in the audience for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful day. We will be back with you tomorrow. Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.